Rain fell hard on the steep streets of Coldwater Cove, Maine, turning the dirt roads into thick mud that slid down toward the dark Atlantic Ocean. Inside the small, cramped pawn shop near the harbor, the air smelled of wet wool, tarnished brass, and old paper. Mr. Weaver, a thin man with dirt under his fingernails, sat behind the counter, rubbing a brass candlestick with a gray cloth. Diana pushed the heavy wooden door open, letting in a cold gust of wind that smelled of salt water and pine trees. She pulled her hood back, her dark hair damp from the storm, and walked straight to the counter without looking at the shelves of forgotten treasures. She did not cry, nor did she look back at the door she had just closed, keeping her shoulders straight and her head held high, despite the water dripping from her faded blue coat. She had walked 3 miles through the freezing storm just to reach this shop, and her boots were soaked through to her skin. Her hands were tucked deep into her pockets, holding the last valuable item she owned in the world, a small blue velvet box that felt heavier than a stone. In the dark corner of the shop, near a row of heavy wooden grandfather clocks, Caleb stood in silence. His long, thick winter coat was black, but his hair was as white as the snow that would soon cover the Maine hills, and his skin had the pale, smooth look of carved marble. He did not move, breathing so slowly that he seemed like a statue left behind in the dusty alcove. He was the master of Stonehaven, a man whom the townspeople whispered about in quiet voices, calling him the king of the northern woods, because his family had owned the timberlands for generations. He had come to the shop to retrieve a brass compass his late cousin had left behind. But the moment Diana walked in, his dark eyes fixed on her, and his hands tightened around his walking stick. He had not seen her in 4 years, not since the bright summer before her life fell apart. Diana reached into her pocket, with hands that shook slightly from the cold, though her face remained perfectly calm. She placed a small blue velvet box on the scratched glass of the counter, her fingers lingering on the worn fabric for a brief second, before she let it go. Her fingers were wrapped in thin cotton bandages, the skin underneath red and raw from hours of sewing heavy canvas sails for the shipping docks. She looked at Mr. Weaver, her dark eyes clear and steady, refusing to show any sign of the hunger that had kept her awake for the last 3 nights. She stood with the rigid posture of someone who had lost everything but her dignity, waiting for the older man to open the box and make his judgment. Mr. Weaver picked up the box, his rough fingers popping the brass latch to reveal a pair of heavy sapphire earrings that caught the weak light of the oil lamp. The blue stones were large, surrounded by delicate silver leaves, and they seemed to bring a piece of the summer sky into the dusty, dark room. Diana watched him, her voice low and even when she spoke, asking for $30 to cover her rent and buy a sack of flour. She did not beg, nor did she explain that her landlord had threatened to throw her things into the street by morning if she did not pay. She simply waited, her face a mask of quiet strength. Weaver looked at the earrings through a small glass magnifier, then shook his head with a wet sigh, dropping them back into the velvet box with a small click. He told her the silver was scuffed, and the blue stones were too heavy for modern tastes, offering her only $12 for the set. Diana did not flinch, though her hand tightened on the edge of the wooden counter until her knuckles turned white. She reminded him that the sapphires were real, passed down through her family for 3 generations, and that she had already sold him her wedding band and her father's silver pocket watch over the summer. She asked for $25, her eyes fixed on his face. The two of them argued in quiet, sharp tones, the rain hammering against the shop window like gravel thrown against glass. Weaver moved his ledger closer, dipping his metal pen into a black inkwell, and offered $15 as his final price, claiming he was being generous because the shipping port was quiet in the winter. Diana looked at the wet streets outside, then nodded once, her voice barely louder than the wind when she agreed to the price. She took the 3 paper bills he counted out, folded them carefully, and slid them into her mended glove before turning to leave. She left the empty blue box on the counter, a quiet admission that she would never be able to buy them back. Caleb watched her go, the tin bell above the door ringing as she stepped back into the freezing rain. His heart burned with a dark, heavy anger, not at Diana, but at the world that had brought her to this dark room in her patched coat and bandaged hands. He had wanted to step out of the shadows, to throw a stack of green bills onto the glass, and to carry her away from this cold harbor town. But he knew her pride, and he knew that if she saw him witness her desperation, she would never forgive him. He waited until her shadow disappeared from the foggy window before he stepped out of the dark corner, his boots silent on the floorboards. Mr. Weaver jumped when Caleb appeared at the counter, nearly spilling his inkwell in his haste to stand up straight and bow to the wealthy landowner. Caleb did not look at him, his focus entirely on the blue velvet box resting on the glass. He told the pawnbroker that he did not care about the brass compass anymore, pointing a long, pale finger at the sapphire earrings instead. His voice was a quiet, deep rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small shop, carrying the cold authority of a man who ruled the entire valley. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet, sliding 2 crisp $50 bills across the counter toward the startled pawnbroker. He demanded the earrings and the address that Weaver had written down for Diana in his ledger, warning him that if he refused, he would have the town council close the shop by noon. Weaver did not hesitate, grabbing the money and scribbling her address on a scrap of paper before handing over the blue velvet box. Caleb took the sapphires, slipped them into his pocket, and walked out into the storm, determined to find the woman he had loved in silence for so many years. Caleb sat in the back of his black carriage, the leather seats cold against his back as the horses pulled the heavy vehicle through the muddy streets. He held the blue velvet box in his hand, his long fingers tracing the worn fabric of the lid. The sound of the rain was loud against the wooden roof, a steady rhythm that matched the ticking of his pocket watch. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting back to the husband Diana had lost 3 years ago, a man named Arthur who had been Caleb's childhood friend. Arthur had been a man of great charm, always laughing and promising to build a grand fortune, but he lacked the discipline to keep his promises. Arthur had invested every dollar he owned, and many dollars he did not own, into failing shipping lines and risky silver mines in the West. He had borrowed money from dangerous people, signing his name to papers that he could never hope to pay back, all while keeping the truth hidden from Diana. When Arthur died of a sudden lung fever, the creditors had descended on their home like hungry wolves, taking everything, including the house, the furniture, and even Diana's personal belongings. Caleb had been away in Europe during those dark months, trying to manage his own family affairs, and by the time he returned, Diana had vanished from their social circles. Caleb was not a normal man, and he knew the passage of time differently than the mortals who lived in Coldwater Cove. He was a vampire, the last leader of an ancient line that had lived in the northern woods since the first cabins were built on the coast. He did not age, his skin remained pale as winter ice, and he had to live on the blood of animals he hunted in the deep pine forests. He had watched generations of families grow and fade, keeping his distance from their small lives. But Diana had been the one exception to his quiet isolation. He remembered the summer day 7 years ago, when he had first met her at a picnic near the cliffs of Coldwater Cove. She had been 19, wearing a bright yellow dress that made her look like a spark of fire against the gray rocks and dark green pines. She had not been afraid of his quiet nature or his pale skin, instead teasing him about his formal manners, with a dry, sharp wit that had caught him completely off guard. He had spent the entire afternoon listening to her talk about the timber trade and shipping routes, realizing she possessed a mind far sharper than any merchant in the county. The carriage lurched as it entered the poor harbor district, the smell of rotting fish and cheap coal smoke filling the damp air. This was the part of town where the sailmakers, dock workers, and poor widows lived, far away from the neat painted houses on the hill. The buildings here were narrow and leaning, their wooden walls gray and rotting from the salty sea air. Caleb looked out the window, his jaw tightening as he realized that Diana had been living in this squalor while he sat in his warm stone manor. The carriage came to a stop in front of a 3-story boarding house that looked as though it might collapse into the muddy road during the next high wind. Caleb pushed the carriage door open and stepped out into the rain, his heavy boots sinking into the wet earth. His driver, an old man who had served Caleb's family for 40 years, looked down from the bench with a worried expression, but he did not speak. Caleb walked past a pack of wet stray dogs fighting over a fish head near the wooden steps, his face set in a cold, hard mask. He pushed the front door open, entering a dark, narrow hallway that smelled of boiled cabbage, damp wood, and cheap soap. A heavy-set woman with a bruised eye and an apron stained with grease walked out of a side room, looking at Caleb's fine wool coat with suspicion. Caleb did not wait for her to speak, reaching into his pocket and tossing a silver dollar onto the small table near the door. He asked for Diana's room, his voice calm and cold, leaving no room for her to argue or ask questions. The landlady took the silver dollar, her hostile look disappearing instantly as she pointed a dirty finger toward the narrow stairs at the end of the hall. She told him the widow lived on the 3rd floor, at the very back of the house, and that she was a quiet tenant who paid her rent on time. Caleb nodded once and walked past her, his steps so light that the rotting wooden stairs did not even creak under his weight. With every step he climbed, his anger at Arthur grew hotter, burning deep in his cold chest. He reached the 3rd floor, where the only light came from a small, dirty window covered in wet leaves from a nearby elm tree. There were 3 doors in the long hallway, and he walked to the one at the far end, pausing to listen to the soft sounds inside. He heard the rustle of heavy fabric and the quiet scrape of a wooden chair against the floorboards. He took a deep breath, settling his thoughts and hiding his emotion behind his usual calm expression, before raising his hand to knock. Diana was sitting at her small wooden table, her hands busy with a heavy piece of canvas sailcloth, when she heard the knock on her door. She did not stand up immediately, thinking it was her landlady coming to ask for the next month's rent early, as she often did when the weather turned cold. Diana called out, telling the visitor that her rent was paid through the month, and she did not need any assistance. When the voice that answered through the thick wood was deep and familiar, her needle slipped, piercing her thumb and leaving a small drop of red blood on the white fabric. She stood up slowly, her heart beating fast against her ribs as she walked to the door and turned the brass lock. When she opened it, Caleb was standing in the dark hallway, his tall frame blocking the weak light from the window and his white hair looking almost silver in the shadows. For a brief second, her proud face showed the raw shock of seeing him, her eyes widening as she looked at his pale, beautiful face. Then, she pulled her cold mask back over her features, her spine straightening as she asked him why he had come. The room behind her was tiny, containing only a narrow cot with a thin wool blanket, a small iron stove that held a single piece of burning coal, and piles of heavy canvas. The walls were covered in cheap peeling paper that had grown damp from the rain, and the single window was cracked, letting in a cold draft of winter air. Diana stood in the doorway, refusing to curtsy or acknowledge his wealth, her bandaged fingers tucked into the pockets of her gray dress. Caleb stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation, his dark eyes scanning the tiny space and taking in every detail of her poverty. He felt the freezing cold of the room, but it did not affect his cold body, though it pained him to know that she had been shivering here for months. He looked at her bandaged fingers, seeing the small red spot of fresh blood on her thumb where she had pricked herself. He wanted to take her hands in his, to heal the cuts and warm her skin, but he kept his arms at his sides. He walked to the rickety wooden table and placed the blue velvet box squarely on top of the pile of white canvas she had been sewing. Diana's face went pale when she saw the box, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the familiar fabric. She looked from the box to Caleb's face, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden hot anger that seemed to warm the cold room. She demanded to know if he had been spying on her, his presence in the pawn shop now feeling like a deliberate insult. Her voice was sharp as she accused him of following her through the rain to watch her trade her grandmother's history for $15. She told him she did not want his charity, nor did she need a wealthy man to come to her rescue like a character in a bad romance book. She told him to take the box back to the pawn shop or throw it into the harbor, her hands shaking with anger as she stood before him. She was breathing hard, her pride wounded by the thought that he had seen her at her lowest moment. Caleb did not answer her anger with his own, remaining perfectly still as he listened to her words, his expression calm and steady. He told her that he had been in the shop by chance to find a compass, and that he had bought the earrings because he could not bear to see her grandmother's pieces sit in a dusty glass case. He told her they belonged to her, and that she should keep them. But Diana laughed, a bitter, sharp sound that held no joy. She asked him what use she had for blue stones when she was $35,000 in debt to half the merchants in the state of Maine. She explained that the $15 she had received from Mr. Weaver was only enough to buy a few sacks of flour and keep her landlord from throwing her into the snow. She told him that Arthur had signed her name to loans she had never heard of, leaving her with a mountain of debt that she could never hope to pay off by sowing sails. Caleb looked at her, his eyes steady and dark, showing no surprise at the mention of the massive debt Arthur had left behind. He had already known the numbers, having spent the morning with his solicitor reviewing the records of Arthur's failed businesses. He knew that she was drowning in those numbers, and he knew that she would rather drown than ask for a single dollar of unearned help. He took a slow breath, preparing to present the plan he had spent the carriage ride constructing. Caleb stepped closer to the wooden table, his large frame making the small room feel even smaller, but his movements were slow and non-threatening. He told her that he had not come to offer her a gift of money, nor did he intend to pay her debts out of pity or old friendship. He said that he had come to offer her a business deal, a transaction that would benefit both of them if she was willing to listen to his terms. Diana looked at him with skepticism, her arms crossed over her chest as she waited for him to speak. He explained that his estate, Stonehaven, had grown too large for him to manage alone, with hundreds of acres of timberlands, several logging crews, and shipping contracts in 3 different ports. He told her that his current steward was old and had allowed the books to fall into disorder, resulting in thousands of dollars being lost each year through sheer neglect. He said he needed someone with a sharp mind for figures, someone who understood the value of a dollar and could not be cheated by dishonest foremen. He told her that he did not want to hire a clerk from Boston who would care only about his salary, nor did he want a young man who would be easily intimidated by the rough loggers. He said he needed an equal partner, someone who was practical and possessed the strength of mind to run a vast estate without fear of hard decisions. He looked at her, his dark eyes fixed on hers, and said that she was the most intelligent, practical person he had ever known. Diana looked at him, her brow furrowing as she tried to find the trap in his words, but his face remained a mask of calm sincerity. She asked him what her role would be, and Caleb explained that he was proposing a marriage of convenience to secure her position. He told her that as the mistress of Stonehaven, she would have the full authority of his family name, allowing her to deal with merchants and bankers without anyone questioning her right to do so. He told her the terms of their contract. He would immediately pay off every dollar of Arthur's $35,000 debt, clearing her name with the banks by tomorrow afternoon. In return, she would move to Stonehaven, take full control of the estate's financial books, and act as his wife in public to satisfy the gossips of the town. In private, they would live separate lives, keeping to their own wings of the massive stone house, and they would not pretend to have a romantic relationship. He was lying to her, of course, keeping his deep love for her hidden behind the dry words of a business arrangement, because he knew it was the only way she would accept. If he had told her that he loved her, she would have seen his offer as a soft-hearted rescue, and her pride would have forced her to refuse. But by framing it as a hard transaction, he was giving her a job that required her unique skills, allowing her to save herself on her own terms. Diana walked to the window, looking out at the dark rain falling on the harbor, her mind working through the numbers he had presented. She knew that if she stayed in this room, She would likely freeze or starve before the winter was over, and her life would be spent sewing heavy canvas for pennies. Caleb's proposal offered her a way out, a chance to use her mind again, and a position of power that would keep her safe from the wolves who hunted her. She turned back to face him, her eyes searching his pale face one last time to make sure he was not mocking her or planning to control her life. She saw only respect in his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement of her strength that she had never received from Arthur or any other man. She walked back to the table, her hand reaching out to touch the blue velvet box, her voice steady when she spoke. She told him that she accepted his terms, on the condition that the contract would remain strictly professional, and that she would have absolute control over the estate's ledgers. Caleb nodded once, his face showing none of the relief that flooded his chest as he reached out his pale, cold hand to seal the deal. Diana took his hand, her warm fingers meeting his cold ones, and felt a strange, quiet sense of peace settle over her for the first time in 3 years. They were married 2 days later, in a quiet, dry ceremony at the town clerk's office, with only Caleb's old driver and the clerk's wife serving as their witnesses. There were no flowers, no white dresses, and no music, just the quiet signing of their names in a heavy leather book and a brief drive north in the carriage. During the 3-day journey to the northern cliffs, Caleb handed Diana a heavy leather case containing the estate's financial ledgers, and she did not look up from them until they reached the gates of Stonehaven. The manor was a massive structure built of dark stone, sitting on the very edge of a high cliff that overlooked the gray, foaming waves of the Atlantic. It was surrounded by thick, dark pine forests that seemed to shield the house from the rest of the world, keeping it in a state of quiet isolation. Diana felt a sense of awe as she looked at the heavy oak doors and the roaring stone hearths, realizing that this fortress of stone was to be her new home. Within a single month, the change in Diana was apparent to everyone who worked at Stonehaven, though she kept her quiet, practical demeanor. The bandages on her fingers were gone, the red cuts healing into pale scars as she spent her days in the warm, dry library instead of a freezing boarding house. Her cheeks lost their hollow, sharp look, filled out by the rich stews and roasted meats that Caleb ordered the kitchen staff to prepare for her. She threw herself into the estate's finances with the focus of a soldier, spending 12 hours a day reviewing receipts, timber contracts, and shipping invoices. She quickly discovered that the old steward had been allowing the local timber foreman to systematically steal from the logging accounts by overcharging for transport horses. Diana did not hesitate, calling the foreman to her study and firing him on the spot before renegotiating their shipping contracts with a rival firm. Her decisive action saved Stonehaven over $3,000 in her very first month, earning her the quiet respect of the honest loggers who worked the woods. The old steward went to Caleb to complain about the new mistress's sharp questions, but Caleb merely poured himself a glass of water and told the man to ensure his figures were correct, because Diana's word was law at Stonehaven. Caleb supported every decision she made, giving her the full authority he had promised in her cramped room. He kept his distance, just as he had promised, living in the far west wing of the house, while she occupied the large, bright rooms of the east wing. They met only for dinner in the quiet dining room, where they spoke of timber yields and shipping routes, their conversations always polite and professional. If their fingers happened to brush while passing a paper across the table, Caleb would pull his hand back with a quiet speed that made Diana feel almost rejected. Diana began to notice his strange habits as the weeks turned into months, her sharp mind observing the details of his quiet, nocturnal life. He never ate the roasted meats or vegetables that were served at dinner, only sitting with her to keep her company, while sipping a dark red liquid from a crystal flask. He spent his nights walking through the deep forests, or sitting in the library after she had gone to sleep, his skin always cold, and his white hair never changing. She realized that he was not like the other men she had known, his presence carrying a quiet, heavy power that seemed to belong to the old woods rather than the modern town. Yet, He was always gentle with her, never demanding her time or forcing her to play the role of a loving wife in their private hours. He treated her with a deep, quiet respect that was far more valuable to her than the poetry and empty promises Arthur had once given her. By the time the first heavy snow fell in November, burying the cliffs in a thick sheet of white, Diana was safe, warm, and financially secure. Her debts were entirely gone, her name was clean, and she had more power than she had ever dreamed of possessing as a widow. Yet, as she looked out at the snowy forest from the window of her warm study, she realized that she had built a wall of ice around her own heart, and she was desperately lonely. A fierce blizzard hit the Maine coast in December, trapping the residents of Stonehaven inside the thick stone walls of the manor for 3 days. The wind howled off the ocean, rattling the heavy glass panes of the library and piling snow high against the dark stone walls. Diana sat at the large mahogany desk, her eyes fixed on a column of winter logging figures, while Caleb sat near the great stone fireplace, reading a book by the light of the flames. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the burning pine logs and the relentless howling of the wind outside the windows. Diana tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting to the man sitting across the room, his white hair catching the red glow of the fire. She felt a rising frustration at the quiet distance he maintained, a distance that had become a physical weight in her chest over the last 6 months. She closed the heavy ledger with a loud thud, the sound echoing through the quiet library and causing Caleb to look up from his book, his dark eyes curious. Diana stood up and walked toward the fire, her dark blue silk dress rustling against the rug as she stood near his chair. She told him that the estate accounts were fully balanced and that her winter projections showed a 20% profit for the coming year, meaning her end of their contract was fulfilled. Caleb set his book aside, telling her in his quiet, polite voice that she had done brilliant work and that he was grateful for her efforts. His detached praise grated on her nerves, and she stepped closer, asking him why he continued to treat her like a piece of valuable furniture he had bought at an auction. She told him she was tired of the wall of ice he kept between them, and that she wanted to know the real reason he had brought her here. She pointed out that while she was good with numbers, he could have hired any clerk from Boston to manage his books for a fraction of the $35,000 he had spent to buy her freedom. She demanded to know why he had chosen a ruined widow with a tarnished name, her eyes flashing with the same fierce intelligence he had admired for so long. She stepped directly into his space, refusing to let him retreat behind his polite manners. Caleb stood up slowly, his tall, broad-shouldered frame towering over her, but his pale face was filled with a sudden, sharp pain that he could no longer hide. He looked at her dark eyes, his iron control finally breaking after 7 years of silent waiting, and told her about the summer day near the cliffs when he had first seen her. He told her that he had loved her then, and that he had planned to ask her father for permission to court her the very next morning. He explained that Arthur had beat him by a single hour, dazzling her with his easy laughter and promises of a bright, careless life, while Caleb had stood in the shadows, practical and silent. He told her that he had stepped back because he wanted her to be happy, but that he had watched in silence as Arthur ruined her life and left her with nothing. He said that when he saw her in that pawn shop, selling her last memory to buy a week of life, he knew he had to act. He confessed that he had invented the business deal and the marriage contract because he knew her fierce pride would never accept a gift of money from an old friend. He told her he had given her the estate to manage because he knew she needed to feel useful, and he had kept his distance because he did not want to control her. He looked down at his pale hands, his voice dropping to a rough whisper as he finished his confession. He told her that her debts were fully paid, her name was clear, and she was now a wealthy woman in her own right, with no obligation to stay at Stonehaven. He said that she was free to leave him and return to her own life, as he would not force her to remain in a marriage that was built on a lie to protect her pride. He turned away, unable to bear the thought of seeing fear or rejection in her eyes. and began to walk toward the heavy oak doors. Diana stood by the fireplace, her heart pounding as she listened to his words, the quiet library suddenly feeling very warm despite the blizzard outside. She looked at his tall, retreating figure, his white hair standing out against the dark wood of the doors, and realized the truth of what he had done. While Arthur had given her beautiful words and left her in ruins, Caleb had given her safety, respect, and her life back, all while hiding his own heart to protect her. She called his name, her voice soft but commanding, stopping him with his hand on the heavy brass doorknob of the library door. Caleb paused, his body tense, before he slowly turned around to face her, his dark eyes filled with a quiet, hopeless sorrow. Diana reached into the pocket of her blue silk dress and pulled out the small blue velvet box she had carried with her every day since she arrived at Stonehaven. She popped the brass latch and took out the heavy sapphire earrings, their blue stones catching the red light of the fire and glowing like ice in the dim room. She did not look away from his face as she removed the plain silver studs she wore and set them on the mahogany desk. With steady, slow movements, she slid the silver posts of the sapphires through her ears, securing the clasps until the heavy stones rested against her neck. She walked toward him, her steps unhurried, but filled with a fierce clarity that made Caleb's breath catch in his throat as she stopped right in front of him. She told him that she had sold the sapphires because she had to survive, but that she wore them now because she chose to stay with him. She looked up into his pale face, seeing the small lines of worry around his dark eyes, and realized she was no longer afraid of his mystery. She told him that Arthur had given her empty poetry and left her with nothing, while he had given her a ledger, an empire, and his quiet devotion. She reached up with her smooth fingers, the scars on her skin a reminder of where she had been, and placed her hand flat against his cold chest, directly over his quiet, slow heart. She told him she was done managing his timber books, and that she would like to manage her husband now. Caleb's breath left his lungs in a ragged sigh, the heavy restraint of 7 long years of waiting, finally shattering like glass on stone. He did not ask her again if she was sure, nor did he hesitate to claim the woman he had loved in the shadows of his long, cold life. He framed her face with his large, cool hands, his fingers gentle as they traced the line of her cheekbones, and felt the silver of her sapphire earrings brush against his skin. He kissed her, his lips meeting hers in a deep, desperate embrace that held all the warmth and passion he had kept hidden for so many years. It was not a polite, formal kiss, but a collision of two people who had survived the darkest storms of the world and found their only safe harbor in each other. Diana drove her hands into his white hair, pulling him closer and anchoring herself to his solid, unchanging strength. They held each other in the quiet library while the winter storm raged outside, the cold finally leaving Diana's bones as she rested her head against his shoulder. Caleb wrapped his strong arms around her, lifting her slightly off the floor and holding her as if she were the most precious thing in his vast kingdom. She closed her eyes, listening to the quiet, slow rhythm of his heart, and knew that she had finally found a home. In the months that followed that winter storm, the cold walls of Stonehaven seemed to soften, the dark stone manor filling with a new warmth that the townspeople could not explain. Diana no longer lived in the east wing of the house, moving her things into Caleb's large quarters in the west wing, where they spent their evenings together by the fire. They shared their meals now, and though Caleb still drank only from his crystal flask, he sat with her as she ate, laughing at her sharp jokes. The local timber merchants and loggers noticed a change in their meetings with the mistress of Stonehaven, her decisions remaining sharp and practical, but her face holding a new peace. The estate continued to grow, its profits increasing under her smart management, and the workers knew that their wages would always be paid on time. Caleb walked through the pine forests with her during the quiet evening hours, his hand holding hers in the cold air. Diana let go of her remaining anger toward Arthur, realizing that her struggles had made her strong enough to stand beside a man like Caleb as his equal. She knew that if she had remained the young, soft girl of 19, she would have been overwhelmed by Caleb's dark world and his quiet, immortal power. Her journey through the harbor slums had given her the strength of mind to look into his dark eyes without fear. Caleb shared his history with her, telling her stories of the old days before the town was built, when the forests were thick and the wolves ruled the hills. He showed her the ancient stone paths that led to the cliffs, and he taught her the secrets of his people, keeping nothing hidden from her sharp mind. They built their life on a foundation of mutual respect, making every decision for the estate and their future together. When the spring finally arrived at Coldwater Cove, melting the snow and turning the dark pine forests green, Diana stood on the high stone balcony of their room. The Atlantic Ocean below was a bright, glittering blue under the morning sun, its waves crashing gently against the gray rocks of the cliffside. She felt the cool wind on her face, her sapphire earrings catching the light as they swung against her neck. Caleb stepped out onto the balcony behind her, his white hair catching the bright sunlight, and his pale face softening as he looked down at her. He wrapped his dark coat around her shoulders to shield her from the cool ocean breeze, his cold hands resting gently on her waist as she leaned back against his chest. They stood in silence, looking out at the vast horizon, knowing they had many years of quiet peace ahead of them. Their marriage had begun as a dry, desperate contract signed in a clerk's office. A business deal meant only to save her from freezing in a harbor slum, but they had turned that cold transaction into something solid and real, a partnership of equals that could withstand any storm the winter might bring. As she looked out at the bright water, Diana knew that she had found a love that was stronger than time itself. Looking out over the gray Atlantic as the tide pulls back from the cliffs of Coldwater Cove, I find myself thinking about the long, winding path that brought me to this high stone balcony. We spend so much of our youth believing that love must be a bright, burning thing, a collection of sweet words, empty poetry, and promises that melt away at the first sign of winter. We chase the sun, thinking that warmth is something given to us by others, only to find ourselves shivering in the dark when the fire eventually burns out. But the cold has a way of stripping away the things that do not matter, leaving behind only what is real, solid, and strong enough to endure. I learned in those dark harbor streets that survival is not just about keeping the wind out, but about finding a purpose that keeps your mind sharp and your heart unbroken. Caleb gave me a ledger when I needed a lifeline, and in doing so, he showed me a respect that was far more valuable than any empty promise of a life lived in the sun. He did not try to carry my burden for me. He gave me the ground to stand on so I could carry it myself. And that is where our true story began. As the spring wind stirs the pines below, I know that our future will not be a simple romance, but a long, quiet partnership built on the stone of mutual respect. We are two survivors who found each other in the dark, and together we have built an empire out of the cold.